We read in Pirkei Avos that there were 10 generations from Adam to Noach, from Adam to Noach. And there were 10 generations from Noach to Avram. After the first 10 generations, God destroys the world with a great flood. And however, after the second 10 generations, although they deserve to be destroyed, God did not destroy them. The question is why? Why the first 10 generations were destroyed? And the Mishnah explains in Pirkei Avos to show the extent of God's tolerance, how he tolerated the misbehavior, but after 10 generations, he ended existence. However, the second 10 generations, although they failed, and also shows us God's unlimited tolerance, but Avram Avinu, Abraham, the founding patriarch of the Jewish people, he received reward of all the 10 generations. He received all the reward they would have received if they would have chosen to act appropriately. So we mentioned in the past, Rabbeinu Yonah, who's the commentator, one of the commentators in Pirkei Avos, explains that initially when God created the world, it was with an objective. And if that objective is not met at a minimal level, God ends existence. It's not worthwhile for God to maintain existence unless it meets a minimal level of value. And since the people failed so seriously, so what was the objective? What was the purpose of Noach, who was considered devoutly righteous and special in his generations? He was supposed to turn around the generation. The whole objective of the ark wasn't only to save him, but rather it was a focal point for outreach that Noach should enter into dialogue and try to convince the people to repent, correct their ways, and the world should not be destroyed. However, he failed, and the world was destroyed. Avram Avinu, the world also should have been destroyed. However, why, regarding Avram Avinu, was it not destroyed? In regard to Noach, yes, was destroyed. Because if Noach himself would have been able to give value to the world, that it was worthwhile for God to keep the world in existence, meaning if he would have addressed the levels of value of accomplishment that the people should have accomplished, the world wouldn't have been destroyed because he would have contributed to where they had failed. But because he wasn't great enough to provide that contribution, therefore God ended the world after 10 generations. However, Avram Avinu, the Mishnah concludes, received reward, the value, the equivalent of all 10 generations. So Rabbeinu Yonah explains that Avram Avinu, although they failed the people, but God did not destroy the world because Avram, so-called, picked up the slack, and he was able to accomplish and cover what they were supposed to accomplish and cover in levels of value, his contribution. So because he contributed to existence, the value of what it was meant to be was not destroyed, and he was the beneficiary of all the levels of the reward that they would have received. And this is what it means in Pirkei Avos. Avram kibel skar keneged kulam. He received reward the equivalent of all the 10 generations. So Noach wasn't able to fill in the gap. Therefore, the world was destroyed. Avram was able to pick up the slack, to make the proper contribution, and therefore he was able to maintain existence. The world was not destroyed. This is Rabbeinu Yonah in his commentary, how he explains the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. Now, we speak about the end of an era. What is an era? An era is a certain period of time, which that period of time represents a certain dimension of personalities or levels of accomplishment. I'll give you an example. Among the commentators of the generations who are the disseminators and the maintainers of the tradition from Sinai going forward, when an era would end, a new era would begin, and the people of a later era could not disagree or argue with the members of the previous era. They were another dimension of person, and the only basis for disagreement would be because I understand what you're saying, but I find some lack of consistency or cogency in what you're saying. But that's only if you really fully grasp what I'm saying. But if the previous era is so beyond the following era, there's no basis for disagreement because it's a total different dimension of personality. For instance, we find the codifier of the Mishnah, the redactor of the oral law was Rabbi Yehuda Nossi Judah the Prince. The opinions which he cites in the Mishnah, that was known as the Tanoic period. The Tanoic period. Then the elucidators of the Mishnah, these people were known as Amoraim. They were the ciphers, the elucidators, to give us an understanding of what the Mishnah says. However, a person who was a member of the era of the Amoraim, who are the elucidators of the Mishnah, they cannot argue with the members of the Mishnah of the Tanaite period, because the members of the Tanaite period, their expanse and depth and breadth of Torah was so great, there is no basis for disagreement, because they don't have the capacity even to fathom what the basis for their perspective and their understanding was so profound, therefore they can't disagree. And then we have the era of the Rishonim, the early commentators, or the codifiers, whether it's Rambam, Maimonides, or it's Rabbeinu Yitzchak Alfasi, or it was the Rashi, or it was Nachmanides, or the Rashba, Rav Shalom ben Aderes. All these were the early commentators. Rabbeinu Nissim. The later commentators cannot argue with the early commentators. The later commentators means this was from the year 1450 onward. That was the end of the era of the early commentators. Anybody who lived beyond that cannot disagree with the early commentators or the codifiers. Because again, the depth and breadth of understanding was so beyond that those who came into existence afterwards weren't able to fully fathom the basis for their position, and therefore they can't disagree. All they can do is elucidate the position, but disagree, they can't disagree. And as time goes on, but right now we're still in the era of the later commentators, okay? So we have eras. Eras begin, eras end, but each era is a different dimension of time, and because it's a different dimension of personality. If you read in the Torah, the 10 generations, we know that before the Great Flood, people lived 900 years, 950 years, even 969 years, 700, so many years. And after each person says, this person lived, if you take a look in the text, the Torah tells us he lived so many years and he died. The next person of the next generation lived so many years and he died. And after each person, it says the years he lived and he died. So the obvious question is, if he lived so many years, evidently, it's obvious he died after he didn't live those years anymore. So why does the Torah have to say, conclude, and he died? He lived 860 years, 50, and he died. If he lived that many years, of course, it's understood he died. But yet, the 10 generations after the Great Flood, it says he lived so many years. It doesn't say he died. It says he lived so many years, which is understood. He lived so many years. That means after those years, he's no longer alive. Means he died. So the question is why the first 10 generations, pre-flood, regarding each one of these personalities, it says he lived so many years and he died. And the 10 following the Great Flood, it says he lived so many years and doesn't say he died. So the Rechaim HaKodesh explains that each person of each of those generations was such an advanced level of greatness, his life was an era. Each one of these people's lives were an era unto themselves. So when it says he lived so many years, when it says he died means, and it was the end of an era. The next person lived so many years and he died, it's the end of an era. So for the 10 generations, there were 10 eras from the beginning of existence until the great flood. Because each person was of such a profound, broad depth, breadth of person. When that person dies, it's the beginning of a new era. However, the second group of 10 generations, which were post-great flood, they weren't of that dimension. So therefore they overlapped. He lived so many years, doesn't say and he died. The next person overlaps, he lived so many years, doesn't say he died. So it was a continuum of one generation to the other, but all 10 generations are the equivalent of one era. Therefore, it doesn't say and they died. It only means they're no longer alive, but they died is like a confirmation. The era is over and that doesn't exist any longer. Now we're ready to begin a new era. Now, let's understand what was pre-flood. Pre-flood was the original creation of the world. God created the world, and the world had phenomenal, unlimited potential. And as I mentioned, we find that pre-flood, people lived almost endless years, 800, 900, 700, 70 years. And all of a sudden, post-flood, the average age was much less, was maybe a seventh of that original lifespan. What happened? What was the change? When a person is endowed with years, why are you endowed with so many years? A person is meant to live 80 years, 90 years. Why is a person endowed with those many years? Every human being has a very unique mission in existence. That's what God puts a person on this earth. Whatever that mission may be, to succeed and complete that mission, God has to give you sufficient time and all the amenities to address whatever those challenges are. So at the end of one's lifetime, one has sufficient time to address all those needs. So therefore, what does that say? If people would live 700, 800, 900 years, what does that mean? To be able to succeed and complete the mission, it takes 850 years. It takes 900 years. They had a different level of mission to accomplish. Post-flood, the people had less of a mission. So if they had less of a mission, there were less challenges. You don't need as much time. They lived less years. But the question is, why pre-flood did they have greater missions? And pre-flood, they had less of a mission. Why? So this I mentioned the name of the Orach Chaim HaKodesh. And he explains it with an allegory. There was this king. He was going to have a wedding for his daughter in about 100 years off. And he gathers the best diamond cutters in the kingdom, and he distributes to each diamond cutter, thousands of diamonds in the rough. And he says, by a date, which is 100 years off, 200 years off, I want you to cut these diamonds. And they have to be cut perfectly, worthy of being at my daughter's wedding. What happens? Fast forward 100 years, 200 years, the king summons his diamond cutters. Because the deadline was so far off, they became distracted, they were delinquent, they never cut the diamonds. And therefore, what did he say? He punished them, and he took the diamonds back, and he ended their lives. So what did the king learn? He learned a lesson, that rather than giving more diamonds to the expert diamond cutters, you give less. If you have less, it's less of responsibility, it takes less time. The deadline now being closer, they'll be focused, more cognizant of their responsibility. So therefore, the challenge is an easier challenge to meet because there's less delay, less procrastination. Therefore, by distributing less diamonds, therefore, the end result would be easier to achieve. So he explains, initially when God created the world, what was the dimension of a human being's soul? It was a soul which was a mega soul, enormous in its value, in its potential. For that soul to be perfected, it took 960 years to perfect that soul. And after 960 years, God's going to recall that soul. Another soul being of this mega dimension, it takes 870 years to perfect that soul, or 770 years, or 650 years. But what happened? The deadline was so far off, people went off the rails. They failed, and they did everything under the sun. The world became totally corrupted to the point God says it's at the point of no return. Even sent him Noach to be his spokesman and to reason with them. And not only did they not get better, they became worse. They defied God. So God said, if that's the case, the world ends. And this is the great flood. The only remnant of existence were the species in the ark and Noach and his 3 sons and their wives and his wife. That was the only remnant of the original creation. They come out of the ark after a year being there. The world is covered with water. The highest mountain peaks have 15 cubits of water above the highest mountain peak. Existence is no longer seen. All of a sudden, the water recedes, a new existence. And as we explained, post-flood is not a continuum of the first existence. It's the equivalent of a new existence. Because we find that everything that God had said at the beginning of the first creation, he said the same thing at the beginning of the second. When Noach had come out of the ark, what do we find? Originally, what was the state of affairs of existence? The world was covered with water. The luminaries did not function. Only the Spirit of God hovered over the water. There was no trace of anything outside of that ark. Noah comes out of the ark after a year, and there's a new world. What does God say to Noah? You shall procreate. You will populate the world. The species will procreate, and they will populate the world. Verbatim, the original blessing he gave to Adam, to mankind, to the species, he repeats it. And what do we find? Noach brings sacrifices, as Adam had brought sacrifices. It's literally a replay, a replication of the original creation. But if this is a continuum of the first creation, what does God have to reiterate and repeat the blessings that he had given initially to creation? Noach is a descendant physically of Adam. The answer is no. When the great flood came, the first existence no longer exists. Noach comes out of the ark, it's the beginning of a new existence. These 10 generations from Noach to Avram, it's a less dimensional person. It's a different reality. The objectives, the challenges, are different challenges. The souls themselves are only a fraction of the original. These people don't have those mega souls any longer. The souls have been downsized. As a result of that, the challenge is less extensive. You don't have to address as many issues that it takes 800-900 years to achieve that level of perfection. You're able to achieve it in 150 years, 180 years. So it's a different level of challenge. As a result of that, the lifespan was less a lifespan. And again, they failed, meaning the model didn't work. It didn't work. Of course, God knew. But again, so why did God not destroy the world? Because Avram, in terms of what their challenges, what they were supposed to achieve, Avram picked up the slack. And he was able to meet the minimum value of existence. And that's why God did not destroy the existence. So as a result of the souls being lesser souls, when it says this person lived so many years, it doesn't say, and he died. Because the end of that person's life was not the end of an era. The first 10 generations, each life, each person possessed a mega soul that you needed 900 years to perfect that soul. That soul in its own right was a dimension of an era. Therefore, it says he lived so many years and he died. It was the end of an era. The next person also had that mega soul. He died at the end of an era. Post flood, we don't have those personalities any longer because the dimension of that spirituality it pales to what originally was. As a result of that, it's just he lived so many years. Torah doesn't have to tell us he died because it's understood that if you live so many years and after the years you're not longer alive, you died for that reason. We speak about eras. We find that even among ourselves, we speak that from Sinai going forward, the generations always are diminished, less and less. It's called niskatno adoros. The generations from one to the next, the generations are lesser. The farther, it's like if you shine a very strong beam of light, the closer you are to that very intense light, you see the radiance of that light. Almost it blinds you, it overwhelms you. But at a distance, you see the light illuminates to a degree. But if you go farther and farther away from that source of light, you have a faint semblance of something that's a light, and you can see the light in the distance. But illumination-wise, it doesn't illuminate. Identically, the generations who were closest to Sinai, they were a different dimension of soul. They had different souls. These souls were the new souls that came into existence, as we discussed. Atem kriyim odom hem lo kriyim odom. When did the Jewish people assume the status, that metamorphosis of spirituality, that the Jewish soul expanded? Because pre-Sinai, the souls of the Jews were Noahide souls. At Sinai, when we became the nation of God, the soul expanded to another level. Now it has totally different needs. We have 248 positive commandments, 365 negative commandments. The soul has to be nourished and sustained differently now. So when did that new soul come about? When they said Na'aseh v'nishma. We said we accept unequivocally. And we heard the 10 commandments. And then Moshe brings the Torah to the Jewish people. And they hear God speaking to them. Although they were in a physical state, they prophesied in the awake state. All the Jews who were at Sinai. After that, the children that were born to those individuals who experienced the Sinai event, how close were they to the source? They were the closest, after the ones who actually had the direct contact. But as the generations continue to distance themselves, those generations, they start waning. The dimension of understanding, we have no relevance. I mentioned once that they had taken the handwriting of Maimonides and they took the handwriting of Einstein to a handwriting expert to just evaluate the two personalities. When he saw the Rambam's Maimonides handwriting, and handwriting analysis has nothing to do with the alphabet or the language, nothing. It's the curvatures and how the person shapes the letters. And then he had Einstein's. And this person said, it's like comparing a monkey to a human being. That's the difference of Maimonides versus Einstein. But he was a genius. He was something you couldn't relate to the man. That's how great he was. But the answer is very simple. Maimonides was from a different era. He was a different dimension of person. He was one of the greatest codifiers. It was something not to relate to. So Maimonides is someone we can't relate to. Rabbi Akiva, who was one of the 10 martyrs, the greatest of the 10 martyrs, who was murdered by the Romans, tortured to death by the Romans. He was the greatest of his era. And the Talmud explains, when it describes his genius, it says he was able to uproot mountains. and grind them together. That was his level of genius, of analysis. He could actually break it down to literally a subatomic particle to that degree. That's the way he understood things. That was Rabbi Akiva. We can't fathom the Rambam. Could you fathom Rabbi Akiva? And his personality and his depth of knowledge and his clarity, his instantaneous level of understanding. It's not to be understood, but it can. Although Rabbi Akiva lived during the Second Temple period, but he still, which is far from what the prophets were, and he wasn't Hillel the elder or the original Tanoim, doesn't make a difference. But he's still closer than we are, or than Maimonides was, or than the Gaonic period. He was closer, or than the Amoraig period. And he was the greatest of the great of his particular era. That's who he was, Rabbi Akiva. So now, a person who has greater capacity, I always say, a person has a limited IQ. Do you call that person a fool because he cannot process many things? Or do you call that person a limited person? He's limited. Can't fault him. What about a person that has superior intelligence? And he goes and he makes wrong decisions due to his level of irresponsibility. What is he? He's a fool. Here you have the ability to achieve and understand things and do things correctly, and you choose to act foolishly and waste your life, or do things which are totally destructive, detrimental to yourself and humanity. You're a fool. How do you not see it? How could you see it so wrongly? That's a fool. We ourselves, we are like the blind person groping in the dark. We're considered peons. We're considered pygmies compared to anybody, even going back 2 generations. So when we're offered a challenge, what's expected from us? We're limited. So if we, in our limited state, of course, every challenge is tailor-made to the person. But despite our lack of understanding, our limitation, breadth-wise, depth-wise, and role model-wise, every-wise, and despite that, we do the right thing. Whose achievement is greater? The early generations or our generation? Our generation is greater. The Chofetz Chaim writes, he says, at one time, if a person wanted to be a colonel or a general, well, what did he have to do? He'd have to first go to officers training school. And it would take maybe 30 years, 40 years to achieve the highest level of rank. And you had to prove yourself. He says, what about if there's a battle, a very serious battle going? A person could go from private to colonel by doing a heroic act during the time of battle. He doesn't need the officers training school. He says, today, this is the Chofetz Chaim writing, we live in a world war battle on all 4 fronts. Because in terms of our weaponry, we have very little weaponry. We don't have the training. We don't have the intensity and overwhelming level of understanding to strategize. And despite that, we succeed. You go from private to general, even with one action. But we're peons, we're pygmies, we're nothing. Because of that, despite our limitation, our lack of understanding, if we achieve, which is unheard of to achieve, despite our lack of sensitivities compared to anything that preceded us, you are the hero, and we are the heroes. So somebody says, well, what am I? Can I compare myself to my great-grandfather? He studied in one of the advanced Torah academies in Europe. He had the greatest giants, but just the opposite. Because you don't have that. And despite that, you do the right thing. Our achievement is even greater than their achievement. Had a case many years ago. This person, he couldn't put on tefillin. So I said, why can't you put on tefillin? He said, because you don't understand. What I did with my hands and what my body was involved in, I'd be disgracing the tefillin if I put the tefillin on my arm. in terms of the way I lived my life. I said to him, just to the contrary. Because that's the way you feel, and you recognize that, you're more qualified to wear the tefillin than the person who was always pure his whole life. Because you feel unworthy. When you feel unworthy, despite the unworthiness, you want to do it. When you do it, it's very special. The one who's always been there, and he doesn't have that sense, he takes it for granted. It's not the same. It's just to the contrary. So we have limitation. As I said, pre-flood, we're talking about mega souls. It took 800-900 years to address whatever they needed to achieve that perfection. And they had different levels of challenge. Post-flood, also, different dimension of soul. But as we father ourselves from Sinai, there's a Kabbalistic concept known as reincarnation. The Kabbalists introduced this. Of course, what they introduced is it's something which has always been, that a soul could go to the world to come, it's judged and evaluated, and because the soul did not fulfill its mission in the previous life, it's sent back. Person gets a return trip, and the person is offered challenges to address the deficiencies of the soul, which was not addressed in the previous life. But you understand, when the soul comes back, the whole soul doesn't come back. It's only the part of the soul that needs perfection. Because if God would send back the whole soul, you know what happens? The whole soul's in jeopardy. Here he perfected most of it, and the part which is not perfected, so what happens is he should fail in this new lifetime. All that he accomplished in the previous lifetime is wasted and destroyed. So when we come back as a sliver, even though our souls initially are ordinary compared to what they were at one time, but even when we come back as reincarnated, it's only a sliver of the original soul. Therefore, our capacity is much less than the previous generations, because their souls may have not been reincarnated, or what had to come back was greater. So therefore, again, to achieve something with a limited capacity, despite the limitation, the accomplishment is a phenomenal mega accomplishment. Therefore, we're worthy despite our levels of limitation. I'm going to stop here.